Hello, fellow teachers. Welcome to Teaching with Power. This is Ben Wilcox, and I want to thank you for letting me be a part of your scripture study or your lesson prep this week. My goal is to help you to study and teach the scriptures with more relevancy and power. This week, we're going to be finishing up the book of Mosiah with just one more chapter, chapter 29, but it's a great one. And then we're going to be covering the first 4 chapters of Alma, starting into the largest book of the Book of Mormon. So remember, teachers, if you're interested in getting access to the materials that I put together for teachers to help reduce your preparation time, increase your confidence in the classroom, and create edifying classroom experiences, just go to teachingwithpower.com and you're going to find links to those resources. Now, if you're ready, grab your scriptures and your marking pencils. It's time to dig deep. For an object to our first lesson here in Mosiah 29, I suggest that you display a set of balances at the front of the classroom. If you have something like that available, you know, the kind that they would use in the past to measure wheat or precious metals, I personally have purchased a small plastic set of balances that I use often in my lessons when I want to illustrate the concept of balancing principles. The gospel is full of these balancing truths, and this lesson features an example of one of them. If you're interested in purchasing a set of balances like the one that I have, I'll include a link in the video description below. For an icebreaker, we're going to start with a little matching activity. How well do you know the different types of government? There have been many types of government tried over the millennia, and there continue to be various forms of government used throughout the world. So I'm going to give you this list, and then you tell me which description matches that form of government. You could do this as a handout, as a teacher. Here we go. The answers are: dictatorship is D, rule by a single leader who has not been elected and may use force to keep control. A theocracy is C, rule by leaders who lead based on a set of religious beliefs or principles. Monarchy is A, rule by a king or queen that has absolute power. That power is passed along through family. Democracy is E, rule by representatives chosen by the majority of the people, usually for a set period of time. Totalitarian is F, rule by a single political party. People are forced to do what the government tells them. And then anarchy is B, a situation in which there is no government ruling. So how did you do on that quiz? Well, this week we're going to get a little political, which I know can be a bit risky for me here. What is it that they say? Never discuss politics or religion in polite company. I'm afraid that today we're going to do both. We're going to break that cardinal rule. So please, I pray that you'll be gracious with me and try to listen with an open mind. Government plays a major role in our lives, and as such, you would imagine the Lord might have something to say about the subject. And he does. The Book of Mormon contains some wonderful teaching on what makes for good government, as does the Doctrine and Covenants. And what's nice about it is that it is fairly nonpartisan. I found that there are principles in the scriptures that political conservatives will most likely find challenging. And there are principles that political liberals will find challenging. And I promise that I'm not going to attempt to paint the teachings here according to my own political leanings, or try to mask the principles either in an effort to be politically correct. I'm just going to do my best to try and present what I feel the scriptures are teaching here. Some background. Mosiah 29 begins with King Mosiah facing a bit of a political problem. He's aging. He's knowing that he's not going to be around to lead his people forever. So he's starting to consider the question of who will take his place. Who's going to be the next king? Typically, in a monarchy, who becomes the next king? One of the king's children, usually the oldest. But Mosiah has a problem. None of his 4 sons want to be the next king. You see, they've decided to build up a different kingdom instead, the kingdom of God. And so last week we heard about their plan to go out and preach the gospel to the Lamanites. So what's King Mosiah going to do? Who do you turn the kingship over to then? And whoever you choose, you're probably not going to make everybody happy. As I'm sure you're aware, not everybody always agrees on how things should be run and who should run them. So Mosiah's solution is to completely overhaul their political system from a monarchy to a more representative form of government. A government made up of judges, elected judges. So in Mosiah 29, we're going to get a chance to look for and identify principles of good government, since King Mosiah is a good king, and he is also inspired by God. Which leads us to our first question. What is the best form of government according to these Book of Mormon prophets? And the answer may surprise you. Look for it in Mosiah 29:13, and then you can also check out Alma's view on the subject back in Mosiah 23, verse 8, when his people attempted to try and make him a king. So in verse 13 first, therefore, if it were possible that you could have just men to be your kings, who would establish the laws of God, and judge this people according to his commandments, yea, if ye could have men for your kings who would do even as my father Benjamin did for this people, I say unto you, if this could always be the case, then it would be expedient that ye should always have kings to rule over you. And then Mosiah 23:8, nevertheless, if it were possible that you could always have just men to be your kings, it would be well for you to have a king. So what's the best form of government then? Righteous kings. Righteous monarchy. Why do you think that is? Why would that be the preferred system of government? My thoughts? If you have a righteous man whose judgment is according to God's will, who isn't power hungry, he's got the best interest of the people at heart instead of himself, how amazing would that be? How quickly could things get done? Righteous decisions could be made and implemented at once. It's a very efficient form of government. In fact, when Christ returns to earth, what will the government be during the millennium? It's going to be a monarchy with Christ as our king, King of kings. And the government shall be upon his shoulder, like Isaiah taught us. And you know, the majority of the people in Zarahemla have good evidence of the virtue of that system. They've been fortunate enough to have had 3 great kings in a row. Mosiah the first, Benjamin, and now Mosiah the second. However, there is a very important caveat with that statement about the virtues of monarchy. Notice that in both instances, both verses, you have the word if before they come to that conclusion. If you could always have just men to be your kings, that would be the best form of government anywhere. But that's a very big if. Because what are some of the major problems with having a king? What are the mishaps of monarchy? Search Mosiah 29, verses 16 through 18, and also 21 through 24 for that answer. What are the problems? All men are not just. There's no way to guarantee that you're always going to get a righteous king. And how much iniquity doth one wicked king cause to be committed? All it takes is one rotten apple to mess everything up. And there's a contingent of people in Zarahemla that know about that problem all too well, from personal experience, the problems that one bad king can cause. And that would be Limhi and Alma's people who had witnessed the great evils that King Noah's leadership had caused. If a good man as a king can do a lot of good very efficiently and quickly, then the opposite has got to be true too. A very bad king can implement bad laws and have a bad influence very quickly and efficiently. Also, in verses 21 through 24, we get another reason. It's very hard to get rid of a wicked king. The only way to do it is with much bloodshed. So as effective as monarchy can be, it's just not worth the risks. Because when it goes bad, it really goes bad, and quick. It's very, very difficult to overcome and recover from that. Even just one bad king. So what's the next best thing, apparently? What kind of government does King Mosiah recommend and establish? A democracy. I know that there are some subtle nuances and definition between democracies and republics, but I just mean a representative form of government. Apparently, that's the next best thing when you can't guarantee righteous kings. I like what Winston Churchill once said. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And yes, I know, democracy isn't perfect. It's just better than anything else. It's horribly inefficient. Just think of how hard it is to get things done or for decisions to be made. In fact, the Nephites are going to face some challenges to the new government right off the bat, with men like Nahor and Amlici that are going to show up on the scene in the first part of Alma. But apparently, it's the best alternative that we have. But why? Why is that? What makes it superior to all others that have been tried? One reason, verses 7 through 8. And now if there should be another appointed in his stead, behold, I fear there would rise contentions among you. And who knoweth but what my son, to whom the kingdom doth belong, should turn to be angry and draw away a part of this people after him, which would cause wars and contentions among you, which would be the cause of shedding much blood and perverting the way of the Lord, yea, and destroy the souls of many people. Now I say unto you, let us be wise, and consider these things. For we have no right to destroy my son, neither should we have any right to destroy another, if he should be appointed in his stead. Now, do you get what he's saying there? If we give my son all that power, who knows if he'll stay righteous or not? Perhaps it'll go to his head and cause contentions. And perhaps King Mosiah is thinking, who knows if he'll go back to his former ways? Power destroys. And we've got no right to destroy my son or anybody else that we might put into his place. Giving somebody that much power can destroy them. You've probably all heard the old adage, all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. A good example of this is Saul in the Old Testament, who started out so humble, so righteous, but power corrupted him. You're probably also familiar with Doctrine and Covenants 121, verse 39. We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. So you don't have to have a lot of authority for it to corrupt you. You don't even have to have authority. You just need to think that you do. Suppose it. Therefore, a good government will always limit the power that goes to the individual. Not only for the governed's sake, but for the sake of the person that's been given the power to begin with. There's compassion in limiting the amount of power that somebody can receive. It needs to be shared. So that will introduce us to the first of 5 principles of good government that I see taught here in Mosiah chapter 29. I'd like to cover those with you. But principle number 1 of good government. Good government limits the power given to any one individual. And now let's go out and try to find some of the others. Let's see if you can discover the other 4. I'm going to give you some verses to study, and you see what you can find. What conclusions would you come to by examining the following set of verses? 29:11, 29:25 through 27, 29:28 through 29, and 29:30 through 34. Principle number 2. It would make sense that good governments would have good judges and good laws. So we should elect or seek to elect good judges or leaders that will judge according to the law. What makes a good law? 29:11, the judges will judge the people according to the law. But later he adds a synonymous phrase, according to the commandments of God. So that would lead me to conclude that the closer the laws of the land match the commandments of God, the better those laws are going to be, and the more happy and peaceful the people are going to be as a society. Now, we're not trying to associate church and state too closely together here, but good principles are good principles. Truth is truth. We're trying to establish a principle by which we can determine if a certain law is going to ultimately promote the common good. Good laws will be righteous laws. So we've got to ask ourselves if the laws of the land make it easier or harder for a person to live the laws of God. There should be a pretty good match between the two. So if there are laws that protect people's lives and property and happiness and help them to be a moral and a just people, those are good laws. But laws that excuse sin or make it easier for people to commit sin, I would argue that those are bad laws. For example, sometimes there are laws that make it easier for businesses or individuals to cheat or take advantage of others. Sometimes there are laws that allow pornographic, ultra-violent, or explicit material to be protected by free speech laws. I sometimes wonder about those laws. So principle number 2 is good governments will appoint wise leaders that enact laws that complement the commandments of God. Principle number 3, in verses 25 through 26. If it's not good for any one individual to have the power, then who is given the power in good government? I mean, you've got to give it to somebody, right? What phrase in these verses shows where the ultimate power comes from? Yes, there are judges, but who appoints them? The voice of the people. The people are given the ultimate power in choosing who leads them, and that is determined by the majority. Why the majority? There's a principle in there. It is not common that the voice of the people desireth anything contrary to that which is right, but more common for the lesser part to desire what's not right. That's why it's unwise to give too much power to one man, as in monarchies, or even a small group of people, like an oligarchy, because it's common for the minority to not want what is right. And that truth makes me wary at times of special interest groups, whether they're right-wing or they're left-wing, because it's common for a small group of people to get so caught up in their cause that they might do wrong in espousing or defending it. So if we ever find ourselves in the minority on any certain issue, doesn't necessarily mean that we're wrong, but it should give us reason enough to pause, really examine what it is that we're supporting. Now, is majority rule foolproof? No, it's not. Take a look at the next verse. And if the time comes that the voice of the people doth choose iniquity, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. Yea, then is the time he will visit you with great destruction, even as he has hitherto visited this land. So yes, it is possible that the majority could end up getting it wrong. But when the majority of the people desire that which is not right, that's a pretty good indicator that your society is losing its way, and it's moving closer to a state that the scriptures call the fullness of iniquity, and therefore destruction. We've got many, many examples of that happening in the scriptures. The Jaredites, for example. So I would say that principle number 3 is Good government operates by the voice of the majority of the people. Principle number 4. What do verses 28 and 29 teach us? And now if ye have judges, and they do not judge you according to the law which has been given, ye can cause that they may be judged of a higher judge. If your higher judges do not judge righteous judgments, ye shall cause that a small number of your lower judges should be gathered together, and they shall judge your higher judges, according to the voice of the people. Well, what governmental principle does that sound like? Checks and balances, right? Don't let any one particular group of your elected officials have too much power. Put checks in place in case that small group gets out of line. This is a major facet of American government. I suppose that you could also argue that the existence of differing political parties helps to keep checks and balances on things too. Although it's true, at the same time, they can be very maddening, and overly partisan politics can keep important things from getting done. But principle number 4, good government employs checks and balances of power. And then principle number 5. I see in these next verses a thought-provoking balance. Balance is an eternal principle, and in government it's no different. So here's where I would maybe pull out my set of scales. And on one side, we're going to place something that I think that we can all agree on is a major role of government. To provide the people with what? Look for the answer in verse 32. And that is to create a system that protects the liberty, rights, and privileges of all people. That's the role of good government. Governments that seek to deny people their liberties, their rights, their privileges is bad government. And I believe that we could all come up with examples from the last century of bad governments that have done just that. Denied people their rights, liberties, and privileges. And sadly, I could give you examples in my own nation's history where, although I feel that in general our government is a good government, but where entire segments of the population have tragically been denied their liberties, their rights, and their privileges. And that's not good. But there is another principle to consider here. There is more to making a nation work than just liberties, rights, and privileges. Those need to be balanced with something on the other side as well. So with my balances, I might take a little block of wood and label it liberties, rights, and privileges, and put that on one side. Or if you don't have an actual set of balances, you could just make a diagram. But what lies on the other side of that balance? Mosiah is going to make an interesting point about being a king. Let's pick it up in verses 30 through 31. And I command you to do these things in the fear of the Lord. And I command you to do these things, and that ye have no king. That if these people commit sins and iniquities, they shall be answered upon their own heads. For behold, I say unto you, the sins of many people have been caused by the iniquities of their kings. Therefore, their iniquities are answered upon the heads of their kings. And so with all that power that's given to kings, there's something else that goes with it. Accountability. Accountability for the actions of his people. He continues this thought in 33. And many more things did King Mosiah write unto them, unfolding unto them all the trials and troubles of a righteous king, yea, all the travails of soul for their people, and also all the murmurings of the people to their king. And he explained it all unto them. That's fascinating to me. King Mosiah is basically saying that heavy is the head that wears the crown. If a society goes bad, the king may have to answer for the sins of all those people. With great power comes great responsibility. God apparently holds leaders accountable for how they lead their constituents. King Noah is an example of this. Remember how it was described? He did cause his people to commit sin. King Mosiah says that it's not right that any one man should have that much power or that much liability either. His conclusion, 34, and he told them that these things ought not to be, but that the burden should come upon all the people, that every man might bear his part. What are we going to put on the other side of the balance? Yes, government should protect our rights and privileges, and when it fails to do so, it is right and appropriate to confront it. But what's our part? What do we call every man bearing his part? Responsibility. And since the power is going to lie with the people, therefore, so should much of the accountability. Can you see how that balance works? Now, a quick exercise. Look at verse 38 and tell me which phrases fit on which side of the scale. Therefore, they relinquished their desires for a king and became exceedingly anxious that every man should have an equal chance throughout all the land. Which side am I going to put equal chance on? Liberties, rights, and privileges. That's the government's responsibility, to make sure that everybody has an equal chance. And then, yea, and every man expressed a willingness to answer for his own sins. And where do I put that? On the responsibility side. You can see this balance well in Doctrine and Covenants 101, verses 77 through 78. According to the laws and constitution of the people, which I have suffered to be established, and should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh, according to just and holy principles. I would call that a rights verse. That's going to go on that side. That every man may act in doctrine and principle pertaining to futurity, according to the moral agency which I have given unto him, that every man may be accountable for his own sins in the day of judgment. Which side am I going to put that verse? Responsibilities. And then there's this interesting note here in verse 79. Therefore, it is not right that any man should be in bondage one to another. So here God is calling out the problem and immorality of slavery. And why is slavery so wrong? I think that most of us would say because it denies people their rights. And that is very true, right? It's a major reason for why it's wrong. But there's another reason too. God also doesn't like slavery because it denies people their accountability and responsibility. He says, I can't judge people fairly for their actions if they had no choice in the matter. So slavery is wrong on both accounts, on both sides of the balance. Back to Mosiah's people then. The king says, if we're going to give you rights and privileges, then you've also got to be willing to do your part and answer for your own sins. In another section of the Doctrine and Covenants that's quite political in nature, we've got a warning about this balance. Doctrine and Covenants 98, verses 6 through 7. Therefore, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law which is the constitutional law of the land. And as pertaining to law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. In this balance, if you give either side more or less, then that cometh of evil. It's going to cause your nation grief. If I were to attach the word more or less to one side or another, our balances are going to get out of order. And we got to try to keep things in balance. Now, in your nation, if it is out of balance, which side do the scales tip towards? And that's going to be an opinion, of course, but it is a compelling question to consider. I know in my nation, the United States, that for much of its history, there has been a gross imbalance on the rights and liberties side for entire segments of the population. And I'm not convinced that those issues have completely been remedied, although great strides have been made. On the other hand, it also seems that there are people and groups that decry the rights and privileges side of an issue in an effort to not be accountable for their actions, or to use them as a license for sin. And they cry out, we want our rights. Don't step on our liberties. Give us our privileges. I mean, how often have you seen people out there yelling, "Give us more responsibility, expect more of us, hold us accountable"? You're just not going to see that, are you? No, it's always about rights, whether it's abortion, drug legality, gambling laws, explicit material in the media, so on. And that's not to say that there aren't justifiable issues and circumstances where rights and privileges need to be called for, demanded, and unrighteous dominion opposed. The religious persecution of the early church, women's suffrage, the civil rights movements, for example. But we also have to consider the other side of the coin when it comes to our personal role in government. What about our responsibility to choose good leaders? Our responsibility to support elected leaders. Our responsibility to follow and obey good laws. Our responsibility to work hard. Our responsibility to be willing to serve and fight for our liberty, or at the very least, support those who do. We have a responsibility to be good citizens. There is a statement attributed to Joseph Smith, though granted its authenticity is debated, right? Where he's reported to have said that one day the Constitution would hang by a thread. If he did make that statement, perhaps this is what he's referring to, that the scales of good government would skew out of balance, tipping so far to one side or the other that the welfare of our nation could be in jeopardy. The next chapters at the very beginning of Alma seem to suggest this. The new government is going to face some real challenges as entire groups of people rebel against a good government, and they become prideful, and they cause major problems for the Nephite nation. But throughout it all, you have descriptions of good people doing good things despite the issues. So, we may not be able to control our government, but we can control us. Even in the worst of political circumstances, whatever country we might be in, no matter how good or bad our leaders are, we can still be good people and live according to our morals. We can see that in Alma 1 through 4. So principle number 5 is good government encourages a balance between rights and responsibilities. Now, don't misunderstand me. I love my nation, and all in all, even with its problems, I believe that there is far more right about my country than there is wrong. I'm very grateful for the Constitution and the liberties, rights, and privileges that my government provides me. Still, I feel we would all do well to remember this balance. And before we move on, I want you to consider a question. To take it to heart, ask yourself, what could I do to more fully bear my responsibilities as a citizen of my nation? Now, I'm not going to take the time to go into these scripture references that I'm going to give you, but if you would really like to study some more scriptural ideas on what makes for good citizens, check out Doctrine and Covenants 98, 6 through 11, and Doctrine and Covenants, section 134. And I encourage you to seek that balance within yourself, even if your government struggles with it. I hope that we can all be good citizens, especially as members of the Church of Jesus Christ. May the nations and communities that we live in be grateful that we live within their borders. And I hope that we'll always keep in mind the purpose for democratic principles and for our freedoms. I love something that Joseph Smith once said. Be wise. Let prudence dictate all your counsels. Preserve peace with all men, if possible. Stand by the Constitution of your country. Observe its principles. And above all, show yourselves men and women of God, worthy citizens. And that is going to complete our study of the book of Mosiah. Such a phenomenal book with so many great discourses and stories and truths. I hope that your testimony has been enriched and fortified by it, like it has mine. But now we're going to begin our journey through the largest book in the Book of Mormon, which surprisingly only covers 39 years of Nephite history. It's named after Alma the Younger, the first chief judge elected by the people. Now, for these first 4 chapters of Alma, I'm just going to briefly cover some of the history and the background of this time period, and then we're going to highlight 2 messages from these chapters. One, we're going to cover just as a quick game, and the other we're going to spend a little more time in depth covering because I feel that it's very relevant to our day, especially youth. So, a summary. In chapter 1, the church faces a major challenge to its authority. We've got an encounter with the second Antichrist of the Book of Mormon, a man named Nahor, who teaches the people that everybody is saved no matter what, and that since his ideas on this are so great, that the people should support him with their money. So you're going to find some valuable teachings on the danger of priestcraft in chapter 1. But Nahor is confronted by Gideon, who then Nahor turns on and kills. Now, under this new system of government, Nahor is not guilty of committing a civil crime in spreading his ideas about priestcraft, right? And he's therefore free to espouse and assert his viewpoint on his beliefs. He's got a right to do that. But once he kills Gideon over it, that's a different matter. That's a civil crime, and he's guilty of murder. And so therefore, he's executed. But still, his influence has already spread its poison, and there's a contingent of the people that are lifted up in pride, and they continue to make problems for the people of the church. In Alma chapters 2 and 3, we have a major challenge to the government this time. A man named Mosiah wants to be king and get rid of this pesky system of judges that are thwarting his desire for total power. So the Nephites, they do the democratic thing, and they take a vote. And the majority of the people say, no, we don't want a king. Remember the principle taught in Mosiah 29, that it's not common for the majority to choose the wrong thing. But Mosiah won't have it. Neither will his followers. And they break off and initiate a civil war. And in that war, the Amlicites are beaten back. But they join forces with the Lamanites, and an even bigger war ensues. But with God on their side, even though they are horribly outnumbered, the Nephites win. And Alma even kills Amlici in a sword fight. So some really exciting stuff in there. And then Alma 4 describes how a greater rift between the righteous and the wicked begins to form in Nephite society, prompting Alma to give up the judgment seat and devote himself wholly to the preaching of the word, bearing down in pure testimony against them. So that's just a bit of a summary, some background to what's going on historically in chapters 1 through 4. So in our previous lesson, we talked about the balance between rights and responsibilities. These first chapters in Alma can teach us some things that good citizens can do to maintain peace and stability in their communities. We also get a chance to see what people do that can cause problems for their society and contention and bring instability to their nation. So to cover a lot of those principles and actions in a short amount of time, you could do a fill-in-the-blank challenge. Very simple game. Give your students the chapter or verses that you wish them to look for the answers in, and challenge them to be the first person to call out the word that goes in the blank. If I'm teaching youth, I'll typically throw out a small piece of candy each time a person identifies the correct verse and word. While I'm going through these phrases, I would also encourage my students to mark them in their scriptures under the label good citizenship. And then for the other side of the coin, you could make another label called bad citizenship. But first, good, from Alma chapter 1. And I'm going to do these in order, chronological order, but I would encourage you to mix them up so it's not as predictable. They were not blank in their own eyes, proud. In verse 20. They did blank the word of God, one with another, without money and without price. Impart. verse 20. There should not any man belonging to the church arise and blank those that did not belong to the church. Persecute. Stand blank in the faith. Fast. Verse 25. They were blank and immovable in keeping the commandments of God. Steadfast. Verse 25. And thus they were all blank. Equal. Verse 26. And they did all blank, every man according to his strength. Labor. Verse 26. And they did blank of their substance, every man according to that which he had, to the poor and the needy and the sick and the afflicted. Impart. Verse 27. They did not set their hearts upon blank. Riches. Verse 30. Now you can send them to chapter 4 for some more. They were awake to a remembrance of their blank. Duty. Verse 3. While others were blank themselves. Abasing. Verse 13. Blank the word of God unto them. Preach. In verse 19. Bearing down in pure blank. Testimony. Verse 19. Now those are all principles and ideas that I think will make for good citizenship. Humility, not persecuting each other, living the commandments of God, which if you're living the commandments of God, by default, you're going to be living good laws of the land. Taking care of the poor and the sick and the afflicted. Not setting your hearts on materialistic things. Doing your duty, your responsibility. These will make us good citizens and healthy nations. But what about the other side of the coin? What things will lead to a falling apart of our nation? We'll just cover a few verses and ideas from chapter 1 here. They ought not to blank with their hands. Labor. Verse 3. Thou hast blank the blood of a righteous man. Shed. In verse 13. Breaking laws will make you a bad citizen. There were many who loved the blank things of the world. Vain. Verse 16. Materialism is not healthy for a nation, I would argue. They went forth preaching blank doctrines. False doctrines. Verse 16. Lies, dishonesty. Yea, they did persecute them and blank them with all manner of words. Afflict. Verse 20. They began to blank warmly with their adversaries. Contend. Verse 22. Those are actions and things that I believe make for bad citizenship. So that's just a quick and easy way to cover a lot of different principles that will help us to be good citizens. But I'd like to focus on this Amlici episode for a minute. I feel there's a really powerful principle that's taught here, and it all revolves around one particular word. To introduce you to that word, I'd like to do this brief activity with you. Look at these pictures. Which one of the dog's shadows is the perfect match? And you're probably going to want to pause the video for a minute so that you can take a closer look. But which one is it? The answer is E. It's not A because the nose is turned up in the shadow. It's not B because there's no collar. It's not C because the tongue isn't long enough. It's not D because there's not space between the front legs. And it's not F because the tail is too long. It's kind of a tough one, huh? Well, let's do another one. In this, which picture is different? Take your time. I know how difficult these can be. And the answer to this one is C. And you can see why, right? Because this cow is standing up on two legs, right? And he has yellow horns. All right, well, all silliness aside, there's a point that I'm trying to make here. The more different the outward appearance is, the easier it is to tell it apart. The more extreme the difference, the easier to differentiate it from the other things. The more subtle the difference, the harder. Extreme, easy. Subtle, hard. Keep that in mind during the lesson. And one more question here. I want you to look up the following verses and find the word that best matches this activity. It's the same word in every verse and the focal point of our lesson. Alma 2:11, Alma 3:4, and Alma 3:8. The word is distinguished. To distinguish something is to set it apart, make it different, to cause it to stand out. We're going to look at two different groups of people in the Book of Mormon who sought to distinguish themselves and how they did it. And if you wish, you might consider using this comparison chart as a handout to help your students see the contrast. These groups are really great foils to each other. You can invite your students to fill it out as you study together. The first group that we're going to examine is that faction of the Nephites that supported the desires of Amlici, or the man that wanted to be the king. They wanted to distinguish themselves, and they do it in two ways. In what two ways did the Amlicites distinguish themselves in 2:11 and 3:4? 2:11. Now the people of Amlici were distinguished by the name of Amlici, being called Amlicites, and the remainder were called Nephites, or the people of God. So first, they distinguished themselves by taking on a new or a different name. They didn't want to be called Nephites. They didn't want to be called the people of God. They didn't want to reflect the name of Nephi. They take on Amlici's name. That's who they want to be associated with and who they wish to support and serve. And then they do something else to distinguish themselves. How do they do it? Alma 3:4. And the Amlicites were distinguished from the Nephites, for they had marked themselves with red in their foreheads, after the manner of the Lamanites. Nevertheless, they had not shorn their heads like unto the Lamanites. And they marked themselves with red on their forehead. They changed their appearance to send a message to anybody who looks at them. And what was that message? In Alma 3:18. Now the Amlicites knew not that they were fulfilling the words of God when they began to mark themselves in their foreheads. Nevertheless, they had come out in open rebellion against God. Therefore, it was expedient that the curse should fall upon them. It symbolized rebellion. So if you were to walk down the streets of Zarahemla and you saw somebody pass by with a red mark on their forehead, what would you instantly assume about that person? That's an Amlicite there. This person is rebelling against our government and our religion. They don't wish to be associated with the people of God or the Nephites. They want to distinguish themselves and be separate. Now there's another group of people in the Book of Mormon that wanted to distinguish themselves as well. And I understand that this story doesn't occur in this week's Come Follow Me chapters. But the comparison is so good. It even uses the same word, the same language to describe their efforts. They also sought to distinguish themselves. And they also do it in two different ways. See if you can find those two ways in Alma 23, verses 16 through 17, and Alma 27:27. And now it came to pass that the king and those who were converted were desirous that they might have a name, that thereby they might be distinguished from their brethren. Therefore the king consulted with Aaron and many of their priests concerning the name that they should take upon them, that they might be distinguished. And it came to pass that they called their names Anti-Nephi-Lehis. And they were called by this name and were no more called Lamanites. So this is the group of Lamanites that had been converted by Ammon and Aaron, the missionaries. And they decide that they need to change something, to change their names, since they had become a new people. They wish to throw off the name Lamanite and all the connotations of rebellion that went with it, and call themselves Anti-Nephi-Lehis. Which I know it's confusing, right? Because it sounds like they're against Nephi and Lehi. That's the way that we use the term anti. But perhaps anti meant something different in the Nephite language. Or maybe the idea is that they're choosing to stop facing or reflecting the values and traditions of Laman and the Lamanites, but rather to face and reflect the values and traditions of Nephi and Lehi. That's who they wanted to be associated with. So they take that name upon themselves. You could also cross-reference this idea with Mosiah 1:11, where King Benjamin uses the word distinguished too. And moreover, I shall give this people a name, that thereby they may be distinguished above all the people which the Lord God hath brought out of the land of Jerusalem. And this I do because they have been a diligent people in keeping the commandments of the Lord. So they too took on a name. And what was the name that they took upon themselves? Later in Mosiah, they take upon themselves the name of Christ. That's who they wanted to be associated with. That's who they wished to support and serve. Well, the anti-Nephi-Lehis distinguished themselves in another way as well. How do they do it? In Alma 27:27. And they were among the people of Nephi, and also numbered among the people who were of the church of God. And they were also distinguished for their zeal towards God, and also towards men. For they were perfectly honest and upright in all things, and they were firm in the faith of Christ, even unto the end. So whereas the Amalekites decided to distinguish themselves with an outer mark, how did the anti-Nephi-Lehis do it differently? These things are all inner things, qualities of the soul. They distinguished themselves by their character. So our chart here, quick review. The Amalekites first distinguished themselves by changing their name. The meaning was to reflect their commitment to the values of Amaleki. The second way was with a red mark, meaning rebellion. Where was their focus? Outward or inward? Outward appearance. And how long would it take you to distinguish yourself as an Amalekite? Not long. Right? Dip my fingers in red paint, wipe it across my forehead, and boom, I'm an Amalekite. How much effort does that take? Not much. Quick and easy. And what was the result of these actions? Look in Alma 3:19. Cursed, condemnation. But in contrast, what about the anti-Nephi-Lehis? They also changed their name, and they did it to reflect their commitment to the values of Nephi and Lehi. Their second way of distinguishing themselves was through their zeal, their honesty, their faith, or in other words, their character. And it meant devotion to God and Christ. And where was their focus, outward or inward? Inner, the inward appearance. And how long would it take to distinguish yourself in that way, through your character? Long time, maybe even a lifetime, to really distinguish yourselves by your character. And how much effort does that take? A great deal, many sacrifices. But what was their result? In Alma 27, verse 30, we're told that they were highly favored of the Lord. So really, there is no problem with distinguishing yourself or separating yourself. It's the way that we do it that becomes the issue. Now we can stop and liken the scriptures a little bit here. Do people distinguish themselves in the same kinds of ways nowadays? Well, how about the Amalekite way? What are some ways a person might seek to distinguish themselves by name or appearance? Perhaps we give ourselves names and labels. I'm progressive. I'm an intellectual. I'm spiritual, but not religious. I'm an ex-Mormon. I'm anti-religion. Or we show our allegiance to a specific group. I'm from a certain gang, a certain social status. Or even music preferences can dictate identities and appearance. And what are some of the outward appearance marks that we may choose to adopt? Sometimes clothing styles can communicate rebellion against society or religion. Hairstyles, jewelry, piercings, the language we use, the places we spend time in. These can all become outward marks of distinguishment. And of course, caution here, just because somebody has a certain hairstyle or a tattoo or a piercing or something of that nature, it doesn't equal bad or rebellious. We should reserve our judgment and treat all people well and be welcoming to all. So that's not what I'm getting at here. I'm asking us to think about these outward marks. But what I'm hoping we will do is that we will look inward, that we'll look at ourselves, judge ourselves, and determine the nature of our own actions rather than pointing the finger at others. Are there things that we are doing that are efforts to distinguish ourselves the Amlicite way? And why do we do those kinds of things? More than likely, it's because we want to stand out in a certain way. Like we demonstrated earlier, the more extreme our appearance, the more we stand out. We're trying to communicate something when we do some of these things. Often it means that we are communicating the idea of rebellion. Rebellion against the church, parents, society in general, our culture, our heritage. And really, it doesn't take much effort or time to do it, does it? Doesn't take a whole lot of time or effort to adjust our outward appearance. We could do it within a matter of hours, or the language that we use, or the places that we go. Rather, I believe that God would have us distinguish ourselves like anti-Nephi Lehis. That's where we should put our major efforts. Through our character. Through things that are more on the inside. Things that require time and effort to develop. Our truth, then, seek to set yourself apart by your character and not by outward marks of rebellion. To liken the scriptures, can you think of anybody you know who you feel distinguishes themselves like an anti-Nephi Lehi? How do they do it? Somebody that really stands out because of their character. And to take it to heart, ask yourself, which of the two ways do I seek to distinguish myself? Like an Amlicite or an anti-Nephi Lehi? What anti-Nephi Lehi quality do you admire in somebody that you know? And what could you do this week to begin developing that quality in yourself? So, my friends, especially my young friends, if you want to be distinguished, distinguish yourself by character. Be an anti-Nephi Lehi, not an Amlicite. And if you want to be distinguished by a name, let it be the name of the prophets, right? Or better yet, the name of Christ. I can promise that if you do, you too will be highly favored of the Lord. And that will conclude our lesson for this week. Thank you so much for taking this time to study the scriptures with me. So grateful for all of you out there who join me each week. And if you feel like this lesson helped you in any way, I would encourage you to share it with somebody else that you feel it could help. Thank you so much for watching. Get out there and teach with